Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jim Falk, president of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and I have really been looking forward to this program. I read the book just a few weeks ago, and I think one of the best way to describe Front Row at the Trump Show is the way Peggy Noonan did. Everyone knows Peggy Noonan, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, the Declarations column, and she said, underlying this book is a story about waking up each morning and trying against the odds to find out what's true. So Jonathan Karl is ABC News' chief White House correspondent. He's also the co-anchor of This Week with George Stephanopoulos. He spent his early career with the New York Post, and we're going to hear about that in a minute. And it's just a fascinating read, and I hope that you will be as enticed as I was by this book. John, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, you know, as I sort of gave a hint, you've known Donald Trump longer than probably most journalists. And I'd like you to tell us about that first meeting when you were almost a cub reporter with the New York Post.
I've known him for just about 26 years. And as I was, beginning the process of writing this book, it occurred to me that I knew him not only longer than any of the other reporters at the White House, but I think longer than anybody on his staff, with the exception of Ivanka. So that photo is from our very first meeting, a crazy story. It's in Trump Tower in his apartment. And if you look at it, 1994, it is just incredible to me as I pulled this photo out of a box of photographs that had been in my basement for a couple of decades, how little Donald Trump has changed.
The tie is still too long.
The tie is still too long. It was a black and white photograph. It's a red tie. The suit is essentially the same, maybe a few sizes smaller than the one he's wearing now. The grin is the same. The hair, same basic approach. And this is the photo where I've seen him take, how many times, countless times in the White House behind the Resolute with somebody, come over, let's get a shot. But this happened when I was a reporter, as you mentioned, at the New York Post. I'd only been at the New York Post for about 6 months, and I was an aspiring political reporter. I'd worked my way up to basically be the number 3 person for the New York Post at City Hall, which is basically 3 out of 3 on a good day. And the Post was the number 3 or 4 newspaper in New York, daily newspaper at the time. And Giuliani was the new mayor. But there was a story that day that made me decide to call Donald Trump up out of the blue. It was a story about Michael Jackson had gotten secretly married, it was revealed, to Lisa Marie Presley. So the king of pop, the daughter of the king of rock, had gotten married, and they hadn't been seen in public yet, but they were staying at Trump Tower. So I called up the general number. I got it out of the phone book and said, let me talk to Donald Trump. It was like a whim. I didn't think I would get through to him. I didn't but I was like, let's see what happens. And I got to his secretary, and I said to her, I've got a story to pitch. I want to talk to Donald Trump. It's like, about what? I was like, well, why would the most famous newlyweds on the planet decide to have their honeymoon at Trump Tower? And lo and behold, Trump got on the phone and said, come on up, I'll show you. So I grabbed a photographer, and next thing I knew, I was on my way to Trump Tower, which was surrounded by a police barricade at this point to keep away all the paparazzi and the camera crews and the fans. And, and I walked right in. He showed me all around Trump Tower, showed me where Michael and Lisa Marie were staying, introduced me to the bodyguards, showed me the tunnels underneath Trump Tower that enabled them to get in and out without being spotted by everybody outside. And it was the beginning of a relationship that I had no idea would end with both of us going to the White House. But that's the arc of this book, and that's the story. That's the beginning of the story of this book.
So people often say that the office of the president changes the person. They evolve. You've known this guy for 26 years, the president of the United States. How has he changed?
Well, there was really only, first of all, I think that the amazing thing is how little he has changed. But there was a moment where I thought that this had changed him. and it was a fleeting moment, but I want to explain it. I did a lot of reporting about this moment in the book. There's a chapter. It is the day that he met Barack Obama for the first time. It was 2 days after the 2016 presidential election. There you see it. Trump has just won the election, and Obama invited him to come to the White House. And they met in the Oval Office. And as you can see, I'm right there with this group of reporters. We are the so-called pool. This is inside the Oval Office. So I'm the only television correspondent in there. There are a handful of reporters and a lot of photographers. And you can see Jared, by the way way off to the right, kind of looking on. He was taking pictures himself. And I had that look of like, oh my God, what am I watching? Pete Souza took this photo. But what blew me away about this meeting is, first of all, the two met one-on-one alone in the Oval Office for about an hour. It was a meeting that was expected to go at the very most 30 minutes. And I was waiting outside that doorway you see behind me for him, for the press to be brought in, but we weren't brought in. The meeting kept going and going and going and going. And when we were finally brought in, I had this sense that I had seen a side of Donald Trump that I had never seen before. It was the first time I was in a room with him where he was not the primary focus of attention, where he was not in charge, where he was not the person introducing everybody, calling the shots, directing, stage managing. This was Obama's meeting. So it was Obama that called the press in. It was Obama who made the opening remarks. It was Obama that, invited Trump to say some words. And when I looked at the two of them together, keep in mind, so it's an hour-long conversation, and I spent a lot of time trying to report on what exactly happened during that hour. But the President Obama outlined to Trump some of the major challenges facing the country, and I think that Trump in that room for the first time, with the first time really being able to process that he had won this election, an election I do not think that he thought he was going to win, that he seemed humbled. That Donald Trump seemed humbled. His body language. I took some photographs. I put one of them in the book. By the way, one of the parts of the book that I actually didn't do until after I had written the manuscript, gotten through all my edits, but the photo section, because I've got just a unbelievable collection of photos over the years that I really hadn't taken the time to go back and look at. But I look at those photos now that I took in the Oval Office, and Trump is a little bit hunched over. He has this look as if the surroundings, he's like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? And he praised Obama in that meeting, praised him quite effusively, said that he would be seeking his counsel as he became president. All of that went away, obviously. And that little moment of humility that I thought I saw was gone within 24 hours. But it's remarkable how similar he is. He is the same guy. The thing that has changed is that the stakes are so much higher. So as a real estate developer, as a pop culture figure in New York, a fixture of the tabloids, he was a serial exaggerator. He boasted everything about himself. It was always the greatest, the this, the that. That's the way he operated. And that is fine and means one thing in that context. But now the stakes are so much different. Even like, look at what we're seeing now unfold, in the pandemic. Every time he's before the press, most of what he's talking about is what a great job he's doing. It's almost as if he's still trying to tell you how great Trump Tower is.
Let's go back, because I want to talk with you in a second about the role that you have with the White House Correspondents Association. But there was that dinner where President Obama sort of made fun of President Trump. And let's look at that if we can now. See what pops up. There we go.
About Mr. Trump, he certainly would bring some change to the White House. all kidding aside, obviously we all know about your credentials and breadth of experience. For example, no, seriously, just recently in an episode of Celebrity Apprentice at the steakhouse, the men's cooking team did not impress the judges from Omaha Steaks. And there was a lot of blame to go around, but you, Mr. Trump, recognized that the real problem was a lack of leadership. And so ultimately you didn't blame Little John or Meatloaf. You fired Gary Busey. And these are the kind of decisions that would keep me up at night.
So that was the dinner at the White House Correspondents Association, which some people have speculated that that's when President Trump said, I'm going to get this guy. I'm going to be president.
I was at that dinner. I talked to Donald Trump at that dinner, reminisced with him a little bit about the story about Michael Jackson, Lisa Marie Presley at that dinner. And as the president of the White House Correspondents Association, Trump, in a rather surreal meeting I describe in the book, summoned me to the White House, to the Oval Office in September, just this past September. And he wanted to complain about a story I had done, but he spent the first 10 or so minutes of the meeting talking about the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is kind of an interesting thing to spend his time on. And he wanted me to know that that was not why he ran for president, and he wanted me to know that he was not upset with Obama's speech. He thought it was okay, kind of funny. So he wanted to totally change the history of that event, but that was a very targeted hit by Obama. He, of course, it came as Trump had gone on this crazy, racially charged, racist crusade, to challenge Obama's legitimacy as president by claiming that he was not born in the United States. So that event. One thing I learned subsequently was that Josh Earnest, who was then the deputy press secretary at the White House, actually called the president of the White House Correspondents Association at the time, who is Steve Scully, who's with C-SPAN, to make sure, look at that, you are good at your fingertips there. So to make sure that Steve Scully knew that it was going to be important for C-SPAN to know exactly where Donald Trump was sitting and to be ready with the cutaway reaction shots. So that's why instantly they knew exactly right there. They were focused on those reaction shots. And those reaction shots are almost as remembered as well as what Obama said, because Trump seemed to get angrier and angrier and angrier. Everybody in the room is in stitches laughing, and Trump is not happy, and it was humiliating to him. Although he wanted me to know that the only reason why he didn't laugh is because of who he was sitting with and didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable. And it was like he had a whole story about everything.
John, tell us really about the role of the White House Correspondents Association, because it really does get to the point of how important journalism is in our country. Well,
the White House Correspondents Association has been around since 1914, founded because Woodrow Wilson was having pretty much weekly press conferences. And there were people coming that were not journalists. There were people that were speculators that were coming, and there were charlatans of one form or another, and stuff that was supposed to be off the record was getting out. And Wilson said, I'm going to stop doing this unless you guys get control over who's coming. And the White House Correspondents, 11 people were, 11 journalists founded to basically determine who was going to come to Wilson's press conferences. But it has been an incredibly challenging time right now, because we have had to go to court twice since I have been doing this to fight the White House when they have attempted to take credentials away from journalists, one most famously the Jim Acosta case. And we We have a really wonderful lawyer, counsel pro bono. His name is George Stephanopoulos, who wrote a document, our amicus brief in that case, which I talk about at some length in the book. I think it's one of the most important documents in recent times on the First Amendment, really about why you cannot allow, why the First Amendment cannot allow the White House to determine who can and cannot cover the president based on their whim. And it's a really powerful document. And so we've had those legal battles we have had to do. We've had a situation where the president has vilified the press and as enemy of the people, fake news, all of this. And then we've had the pandemic where as this crisis has hit, we had to face a challenge of how can we continue to cover the White House, protect our own health, protect the health of the of the people that work at the White House, and continue to do our story. And there's an event from last week in the Rose Garden. As you can see, I'm off in the left-hand corner there. We have had to limit the number of reporters coming into the White House so we can do social distancing in a very cramped place. The Rose Garden is big in comparison, but the briefings you've seen in the press room, it's a very small space. There are 49 seats, and on any normal time when a president is in there, you'll probably have upwards of 100 journalists in there because people cram up and down the aisles and the back, and of course every seat is taken. So we have marked off only 14 seats, and we've had to do an elaborate rotation of who can be in there and try to be representative of the press corps at large. And it's been an immensely challenging time, but I think a really important time.
Who sits where?
Well, we do, the White House Correspondents Association, and we've had to battle a bit. The White House has, this White House has suggested at various times that they were going to take it over from us and even or throw us out of the White House, or we're going to determine the seating assignments. I mean, in the early days of the Trump White House, I mean, I thought for sure Sean Spicer was going to go in there and make sure that it was, Breitbart and, Newsmax and Fox and like nobody else, and we've had to fight to maintain, our ability to do that. But it's a really, I think it's an important organization. When I signed up for this job, I had no idea what I was really going to be up against. And you want to do it all in the context of not being in a battle directly with the White House, because we covered the White House, but so our issues are access, First Amendment, and making sure that we can do our job and cover the president. But we are not the opposition party. That he wants to define the press as the opposition party. So we have to push back when it's absolutely essential to push back, correct the record when the record absolutely has to be corrected, but continue to do our jobs and to treat the president in a fair and objective way, just like we would any other political figure.
Let's talk for a minute about the role of the press secretary, because there certainly have been some incredible men and women who have held that position, from obviously Jim Brady, Marlon Fitzwater, and others. Right. Who I guess that was the first press secretary you worked with. Is that right? Yep.
I've worked now with 14 different press secretaries.
And probably more in this administration than any other.
I'm on number 4 right now.
We have a question from Lynn Lewis. She's one of our viewers. Is this the first president who has conducted his own press briefings and not his press secretary? And as you said, how many press secretaries has he had? But but what is the role of the press secretary from your vantage point?
Well, first to quickly answer that question, we've never had a president do daily press briefings like he was doing for some time at the beginning of this crisis. And by the way, the amazing thing about that is the press secretary was nowhere to be seen. It was, at that point, it was Stephanie Grisham. She wasn't even in the room when the president would conduct those briefings, which is something, it's just hard to imagine. And she, of course, she served in that job for the better part of a year and never once held her own press briefing. I mean, that's just a entirely new standard. There she is, Stephanie Grisham. And on paper, she was the most powerful press secretary ever because she was simultaneously the press secretary, the communications director, and the press secretary for the First Lady. But really, you know, Donald Trump is the press secretary. He is the communications director. And I mean, he is his own chief of staff. He is the one calling the shots here. Every press secretary I have seen, all 4 of them so far, you know, have had to try to gauge how he, you know, knew that, first of all, there you have all 4 of them. So, you know, Spicer would be out there, and sometimes during one of his briefings, the president would tweet something, you know, and then Spicer would be asked about it. He's like, well, the tweet speaks for itself, because he had no idea what the president was, you know, what he was going to be doing to undermine what he was saying from the podium, or to have a different message. But that's, you know, the truth truly is that it is Trump. It is Trump who is his own person. And so we went over a year without a press secretary holding a briefing. Now Kayleigh McEnany has started to hold briefings, but during that time, Trump, it was on one hand, it was kind of, we complained, we made an issue of it. It's important for press secretaries to have briefings, but you know, Donald Trump on an almost daily basis is taking questions from reporters.
Well, I think he sort of views himself as the Bruno Arledge.
Yeah. No, I mean, I say that, you know, this is, I call it the Trump show because that's how he sees it. And he sees himself as the executive director of the Trump show. He's obviously the star of the Trump show. He is the chief publicist of the Trump show. This is his show.
So we have a question from Martha. Many individuals in the White House press corps often interrupt the president's answers during press conferences and appear to be more combative than we've ever seen in any other occupant in the office. Do you think the press corps is under any obligation to demonstrate respect to the office of the president, no matter who the incumbent is?
Well, I thank you. So Martha?
Yes.
Martha, thank you for the question. And I absolutely think that we need to and must respect the office of the presidency. And more than that, respect the fact that the person holding the office of the presidency was elected by the American people. And so you're respecting all that represents. And I think that there are certainly times where it has been incredibly contentious in there. And excuse me, one of the challenges of doing appearing from home is the phone may ring, and
sorry, my dog barked a minute ago.
So yes, and I think that there have been times when it has been uncomfortably contentious in there. I do have to say though that you know, the president is driving much, if not all of that. There's the famous thing that had the questioning from Jim Acosta, and I write at length about that. I wasn't comfortable sitting there and exactly how Jim went about asking the questions and still kept on going. But the way the president personally and savagely attacked Jim Acosta was really beyond the pale. And the way he does it on an almost daily basis now. You know, there's my friend Weijia Jiang of CBS News, and she's the only Chinese American reporter out there at that given point. And the president kind of lashed at her, saying, "Ask China that question." And you know, and she felt, and I think legitimately felt, that she was doing that because she's Chinese American. Although she moved to this country when she was 2 years old and was raised in West Virginia. You know, the president was implying that she had some kind of a different loyalty.
So let's roll the video of how he gave you a review.
Sure.
Of your reporting skills.
Sure.
Oh
you didn't tell me that. Oh, I see. You didn't tell me that, John. You didn't tell me that. Did serve in the previous administration. You mean the Obama administration? Thank you for telling me that. See, there's a typical fake news deal.
You asked me when she was appointed. I told you when she was appointed.
You're a third-rate reporter, and what you just said is a disgrace, okay? You asked me, you said, sir, just got a point.
So,
I mean, look.
yeah, how do you handle that?
So I think it's really important, even when the president is, and by the way, he went on to tell me I would never make it. He's like, you'll never make it. You know, I don't take it personally. You know, I don't want the story to be about me fighting with the president, but you know, I've got to correct the record. I've got to like say, I mean, he was at that point, you know, we were going back and forth over what the Inspector General at the HHS had said about testing in the country, and he was trying to turn it into, you know, a whole different thing and a war on the media. We need to keep focused on what the issues are that matter, the facts of what the administration's doing, what he is doing. Sometimes it does get very contentious in there, often driven by the president himself. But what's interesting is on one side of it is Martha's question, which I think is a totally legitimate one. You know, shouldn't you respect the office? I think the answer is yes. The other side that I get is I have people saying, why do you let him go on and on? Why don't you yell out, that's not true, Mr. President? Why don't you, get in his face or walk out when he say, I mean, you have some people that think that we're not being respectful enough of the president, and you have some people who think that we are legitimizing the president, which I think is kind of a funny phrase because I think the Electoral College is the body that legitimized the president. But, you know, our job is to ask questions, including hard questions. And I did it of President Obama. I did it of President Bush. And I do it of President Trump. And I treat all three men with respect that, for having that office, respect for the office, respect for who they are. But it does not mean that we shy away from asking tough questions. That is our job.
Let's hear from Ray Termini. Go ahead, Ray.
Will the United States ever be the same after Trump? I mean, it seems to me that many people, Democrats and Republicans, are now defining the truth in relative terms, accepting as true only what they want to believe and yelling fake news at everything else.
It's a really good question, and I feel like it. I hope that you can read the epilogue from my book. Would you mind if I read a little passage, because it's directly on that, and the context here is I talk about how the president was very angry with me because I mentioned Hurricane Dorian, back in September. That he had said it was going to go to Alabama, and the National Weather Service said that it wasn't, and it prompted this whole week, Sharpie Gate, and it was kind of a trivial story, to be honest, but it dominated news coverage for a week, Anyway, so I in the conclusion I write here, history will little note the president's deceptions to cover up a simple mistake he made about the hurricane's path, but it will long remember that he used the power of the presidency to blur the lines between truth and lies. Donald Trump was a serial exaggerator long before he ran for president. It's how he built the brand. As a 37-year-old, Donald Trump told the New York Times sports writer Ira Berkow in 1984, quote, "Creating illusions to an extent is what has to be done." That's how he made the top floor of Trump Tower the 68th floor, even though the building only has 58 stories. The floor directly above the 5th floor was labeled the 14th floor, skipping 10 numbers, and voila, a 58-story building appears to have 68 floors. Donald Trump hasn't changed since he pulled off that sleight of hand decades ago, but when he was lying about the number of stories in his buildings, it really didn't matter. When he uses the power of the presidency to convince supporters they shouldn't believe what they see with their own eyes, it does matter. And I go on to make the case that although we are deeply divided in this country, the danger is, and what I worry about, is that we now have a situation where not only are we divided in terms of views on fundamental issues, we're divided on what is true and what is false. And if you cannot come to an agreement about what is true and what is false, you cannot overcome that divisions. So let me read one more paragraph on this about how it's not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't start the war on truth any more than he created the deep divisions in our country. The media landscape is a factor here. The proliferation of news outlets and the democratization of information through the internet give Americans the power to be more informed than ever, but it also makes it easier for us to feast on a diet of information that echoes and never challenges our biases and our beliefs. This deepens our divisions and makes them more difficult to overcome. Donald Trump has poured rocket fuel on this deeply destructive trend. He may be motivated only by an insatiable desire to promote himself, but his assault on truth is toxic and contagious. It infects those who support him and those who oppose him, and the contagion is global. So I do worry that there's been a lesson learned from all of this. It has infected people on all sides of the political spectrum, and to a degree, the news media as well. Now, I'm hopeful that, you know, that this doesn't do lasting damage at the end. I end on a very optimistic note, but I, to the listeners, to the viewers, you know, question here, I think about that a lot, and I struggled with that as I finished this book.
Let's talk for a minute about, is this a strategy that President Trump has, or is it a knee-jerk reaction, or that he's living in the present? And I found the coverage, or in your book, where you talked about the interview he had with Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes so interesting. And I'll just quote what she said. President Trump said, Donald Trump at that time, I do it to I guess he was president at this time. I do it to discredit you all and demean you all. So when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you.
Yes.
So does it work?
Well, you asked, is it strategic? And first of all, in my book, I thought this was such an incredible story to have met Donald Trump back, you know, so many years ago, and to have known him and seen him over the years, and to have kind of both of us land in the White House, and my interactions with him behind the scenes, as well as playing out before the cameras, are, I think, unlike any other interactions we have seen between a president and a reporter. And in the process of writing the book, I was able to go back and talk to all of his senior advisors, almost without exception, and learn things that I did not even, I mean, I thought I knew what was going on, but I learned levels of nuance and stuff behind the scenes that just blew me away. So that's why I wanted to write this. I didn't want to like this is not an anti-Trump polemic. It's not a pro-Trump polemic. It's a story. But you ask if he's strategic. I do not think he is strategic about much of anything. And Trump acknowledges this. In an interview with Barbara Walters back in 1987, so long before he was ever going to be running for president, Barbara Walters asked him what his grand vision for his life is. What does he want to accomplish? What does he want to do? And he basically said he doesn't have such a grand plan, because he thinks like the prize fighters. When a prize fighter gets in the ring, you don't come in with a plan. I'm going to do this, a couple lefts or right, or this. You go with the punches. And Donald Trump's been going with the punches ever since. It's not a strategic plan. But if there is one thing he has been strategic about, it's this idea of attacking the press so that they are seen as an opposition party. He has used the phrase, it was a phrase that I first saw used in this context by Steve Bannon, but was quickly adopted by Trump. You know, if you can look at the press and make people think that they're just seeing like the Democrats, so that a story in the New York Times is no different from a press release issued by, you know, the Clinton campaign or the DNC, then it's not taken seriously. It's not truth. It's just a political back and forth. And so I think that's been one element to it. The other element is he senses his crowds very well. This is the rolling with the punches part of it. He senses his crowds. And one thing he sensed pretty early on is the strongest applause lines he was getting was when he attacked the press. So he knows every good show needs a villain. And the villain in this case is the press. By the way, that photograph, and you notice how all the photographers are not taking a picture of Trump right there?
Mm-hmm.
That photograph is of the day that Kanye West came into the Oval Office, which was one of the more remarkable things I had ever witnessed. But
that was an odd, I mean, he was in the office and Kanye West spoke for like 20 minutes or something, didn't he?
Yeah, it was really something. And because of this relationship I've had with Trump, so you see him looking right at me, he's talking to me. He's done this so often where he is turned to me, no matter how many people are in an event and no matter what the event is and what the stakes are, he like uses me as like a sounding board and makes me like, tries to draw me in. And I'm a reporter. I want to be like, you know, look at me. I'm kind of like, don't talk to me right now. I'm here to cover what you're doing. This is the photo I took right there. That is taken with my camera. And he is pointing at me and saying, you don't think so, John. You don't think so. And I mean, he does this all the time. It is,
So I have a question from Laura, and she says, is there anything more positive or favorable about President Trump than we see in the press? Because obviously you spend so much time with him, perhaps where, you know, it's not aired. And so is there a different side of him?
So he can be incredibly, charming. He tries to make you feel really good when you're in his presence, unless he's yelling at you. I've seen both. Effusively complimentary, because he wants everybody around him to feel like it's a great thing to be around him. He does swear a lot more in private. Actually, by the way, I did an interview with, I was interviewed for the book by Billy Bush. And I made that comment, not really processing who I was saying it to. I said, yeah, he's a lot more vulgar in private. You know, he's like, no, I know.
Yes, indeed.
I know that very well. Yes. But you know, and he does ask questions in private. Sometimes you see it at some of his events, but he does always seem to be surveying people and trying to gather information. I don't know what he does with that information, but I mean, almost every time I'm in a situation with him, he's asking me what I think of X, Y, or Z, and sometimes I'm not comfortable to say what I think. I mean, I'm not his political advisor. That's on Air Force One. That was Donald Trump's first trip on Air Force One. Actually, this is he was going down to Mar-a-Lago after being in office for a little less than a week. Stephanie Grisham is in the shot standing up. She was at that point Melania's press secretary, but she was the one tasked to go on this trip.
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about President Trump, but some of the conflict with the White House press corps goes back, you know, many administrations. And with President Obama, it was sort of a rocky relationship, and you really had challenges covering him.
Yeah, no, it was, and President Obama was often deeply resentful of the White House press corps, which he believed focused on trivial things, not important things, was excessively negative, and didn't pay attention to the accomplishments of his administration. Now, that description, which I just gave you of Barack Obama and the way he saw the press corps, I think applies to virtually every president we have ever had, going back to Washington. But Obama rarely, you mentioned Peter Baker. I'll give you a little anecdote. We were, before this event, we were talking about Peter Baker, the great White House reporter for the New York Times and a great author, just a really smart guy. He was covering Obama for the New York Times. And I remember asking him at one point, about a year before President Obama left office, you know, how many, I don't know how it came up, but he mentioned to me, that he had never asked a question. He had never been given the opportunity to ask a question of Barack Obama. He had never been called on at a press conference. Obama had never given him an interview. And he, because President Obama, there you see him giving, there's President Obama giving an interview, giving a press conference in the briefing room. He didn't do a lot of press conferences. When he did, he didn't call on a lot of reporters. His answers were always, were quite lengthy. He almost never gave interviews to White House correspondents. He, and Bush did this and really kind of began this trend, although it precedes Bush, but Bush did it a lot, tried to bypass what we might call the mainstream media to go to friendly voices. Now Trump has done it, way beyond that. There was a period of like a year where I saw he didn't give an interview to anybody that wasn't Fox News. But that process had started with President Obama. He gave interviews with YouTube influencers who were sympathetic, sympathetic radio talk show hosts, but didn't want to deal with the actual press. He set up a thing called West Wing Week, which Josh Earnest hosted, which was a weekly summary of news at the White House. And it looked a little bit like, I like Josh a lot, but this looked like something that would be more than you might see it like in like North Korea, like an official like state media, like here's the perfectly imaged of here's our leader, well,
let me interject because we have a question here that sort of gets on the subject. Ask John about the president's ability to go around the media to engage with supporters directly. And apparently the campaign, which separate from the administration, just released a Truth Finder website aimed at, quote, exposing Biden, encouraging people not to trust the media or even the internet on this or other subjects.
Yeah, they've been very, obviously the biggest factor and on any given day, I think every day, maybe several times a day, President Trump asks Dan Scavino, the guru of his social media, how many followers he has on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And Dan always has the number at his fingertips, and it's a lot of people. So the president himself has an ability to kind of dominate world conversation with a single tweet. But the campaign has worked on developing their own separate channels. They're very sophisticated about it, and they do it very well. They do it. Like I said, President Obama worked to do this as well, but Trump has taken it to an entirely new level.
What about leaks? Dory Crenshaw asks, most presidents have complained about leaks within their administration. How does the current administration compare with others? Is there a character of leakers different from previously?
Yeah, and I actually devote a chapter in the book to this. President Trump has dealt with something that is far beyond any of his predecessors, and I think it's fueled a lot of his anger at what his supporters and he occasionally calls the deep state. So whatever you think of that very loaded term, I will say that he has a legitimate gripe about the leaks, and I'm not talking about the leaks of what was said from one administration official to another in some meeting. I'm talking about deeply disturbing national security leaks. And I will give you the example that I go into some depth and try to deconstruct from the first weeks, really the first week or so of his administration. He had phone calls with the Prime Minister of Australia and with the President of Mexico. And those conversations, what he said in those conversations and what those leaders told him quickly leaked. There were news stories. And then by that summer, his first summer, the Washington Post actually published the entire transcripts of those conversations. Now, that's insane. As a journalist, it was like a window. I'd never seen a transcript of a president's, private conversation, phone conversation with a world leader. It's very interesting. But imagine you're the president, you're having a conversation with another world leader, and somebody takes the transcript and gives it to the Washington Post. Really unbelievable. And we've seen every administration, every president complains about leaks. none had to deal with anything remotely like that. Even the, when the president met with Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in the Oval Office the day after he fired Comey, my Lord, the details of that conversation, exact quotes, leaked out within 24 hours.
Yeah.
I would make one a little paranoid, wouldn't you think? If you knew what you were saying in the Oval Office with like nobody around, was in the newspapers the next day.
You'd look for those recording devices.
Yes.
We have a few more minutes, and let me remind people that you can ask a live question. Just raise your hand and we'll get to you. We have 2 questions on this topic. I'll read it from Joe. Do you and other members of the media resent the inclusion of non-news and quasi-news organizations? Should we be revisiting the ability of clear propaganda outfits? This person says Fox, but also OAN, and I would add Sputnik, to present themselves as just another news outlet, especially now when you're in a situation where you have limited seats.
Well, I recount some of the craziness of the early days when Sean Spicer, and man, there are some interactions with Spicer in this book that
Some slammed doors, if I remember.
I mean, my Lord, it's just hard to believe it really all happened. But Spicer froze me out for a while, like he froze out other of my colleagues, and just refused to call on me at his briefings. And I'm sitting right in front of him. I mean, it's really hard to do. I've got my hand, but I remember him not calling on me, but calling on a guy that worked for Sputnik, which is literally the Russian government. I mean, it is a Russian government-owned news site. So like the Russians were getting called on, but ABC News is not getting called on. It was really something else. I'm sorry. You got me going on Sputnik. What was
Really, I mean, do you guys in the White House?
Yes. So
what can you do about it?
So look, I think that you want to have a diversity of voices in that room, and that means diversity of viewpoints as well, and there are, Huffington Post is in there, and Newsmax is in there, and that's a good thing. They each have real reporters, and some would argue an editorial slant. That's fine. Where it kind of crosses the line is where you do have pure propaganda outlets, and that kind of falls, there's a give and take with the White House Correspondents Association, and OAN no longer has a seat in the briefing room, and it's because, as you see, one of their reporters, we're trying to protect the press corps, social distancing, limiting the number of seats, everybody's sharing. And they started showing up, and you can see just being a foot or two away from the person there in that last seat, and total violation of the rules. But it is a broad group of news organizations represented in there, and I think that's a good thing.
John, I really found it so interesting about this behind the scenes communication that was going on with the campaign back in 2016, 2015, especially with Bill Shine and Michael Cohen. I mean, that was just really bizarre, and a whole, sort of side that I was surprised by.
Yeah, there's some dramatic scenes with, well, first of all, I mean, there's one story of an interview that I had with Trump in 2014 before he was a candidate. And Michael Cohen was the one that was kind of working out the details with my producer. His name is Jordan Phelps. and he was browbeating her, saying that if this interview doesn't go well, I'm going to push the camera out. I'll slam the camera to the ground. So he better not mess around. This better be a fair interview. And Jordan's reaction at the time was, that man's going to end up in jail. And you know what? He ended up in jail. He did end up in jail. But there were some fascinating negotiations going back and forth between Bill Shine at Fox News as one of the senior executives and Michael Cohen after that first debate, which, as you remember, was in Cleveland and was a Fox News hosted Republican debate, primary debate. And this is where, you know, Megyn Kelly famously went after Trump and asked about all the things he had said about women, and also where Bret Baier kind of embarrassed Trump at the beginning by asking any candidate not willing to say they will definitively support the Republican nominee, raise your hand, and only Donald Trump's hand went up. And Trump was infuriated, especially more so by more than the debate, by a focus group on Fox that Frank Luntz did right after the right after the debate. And Cohen is threatening that Trump's going to freeze out Fox, and they're having these negotiations back and forth. And I detail it all. I talked to all the people involved. It's pretty fascinating.
And I mean, let's say this. I mean, that is unprecedented. That doesn't happen with other networks.
I mean, not to that extent. I mean, there's always a back and forth, but like basically, what I learned was that the Trump campaign demanded that Frank Luntz be taken off the air, and that he not be allowed to appear anymore. And for a long period of time, Luntz did not appear on Fox News. Suddenly, all his appearances were canceled, and this was demanded by the Trump campaign. Pretty amazing.
John, we got Memorial Day coming up, and I want you to tell our viewers a little bit about your dad. He was pretty determined and could be a little stubborn himself. Tell us about the situation he had in Florida.
So I write about this in my acknowledgments, which are often kind of like an afterthought. I actually felt very passionate about my acknowledgments. My father died before this book was written, but after Trump was elected, and he was a volunteer fireman his entire life. 10 years while I was growing up, he was the chief of our volunteer fire department. He was the kind of guy that never missed a Memorial Day parade, a 4th of July parade. He was very active in the Kiwanis Club. He was active with the Red Cross. He was a very patriotic American, and he loved his flag. Big NASCAR guy, country music guy, and he moved into a place in Florida and wanted to put up a flagpole, because every place he's ever lived, he's put up a flagpole. And the homeowners association wouldn't allow it. He fought him. When he lost the battle, he put the house up for sale, and he moved somewhere else where he could have his flagpole.
That's a great story. John, I want to thank you so much for writing such a good book, and for all the work that you do each and every day to bring us the news. Again, congratulations, and stay well.
Hey, thank you. And you too. And I really appreciate you having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all who are watching. I wish we could have done it in person. Maybe we'll
get you to Dallas. And
comes back.
We'll get you some good barbecue back in Dallas one of these days. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you on Friday.